Hi, welcome to your Gross and Fine Motor Development Birth to 3 First Voiceover PowerPoint for our Pediatrics course. You can click on the little speaker icon on the slide and listen to the audio on this, and you can re-listen and re-listen as often as you would like. So let's start with some general concepts with regard to normal development. In a younger child, normal development is going to be a larger range. So the younger the child, the larger the range of typical. For example, we expect walking anywhere between 9 to 18 months. That's in young children, obviously. When we get to older children, we can more generalize into what a 6-year-old can do or what a 7-year-old can do. We can't do that so much with a 1-year-old. So when we're looking at, for example, 12 months, we say, okay, a child walks at 12 months. That's sort of the middle of the 9 to 18 months, and that's typical. But we do see 9-month-olds walking, and we do see children not starting walking till 18 months old. So how do we know what's typical? How do we know when to be worried or not? And that comes in with the quality of how the child is moving. So, for example, if we have an 18-month-old who is not quite walking, or a 17-month-old, however, they are getting up to stand quite nicely. They look like they have nice control over their muscle movements. They are nice and steady on their feet when they do get up into standing. They're cruising along furniture, which is walking, holding on, and they're letting go and balancing a bit. They're just a little nervous to let go and start walking, but everything else looks great. Their reflex integration looks good. They're excited. They're interested. They're pushing themselves and trying. We're not going to be too worried about that 17 or 18-month-old. However, if we have an 18-month-old who is pulling to stand very shakily, and once they're up there, they're holding on for dear life, they can't even think about letting go, or we see a child at 18 months old who has a lot of difficulty getting down from standing. Their legs get very stiff or spastic or tight. Or if we see a child with terrible, terrible balance, but they're sort of up there thinking about walking, those children we're going to be a little more concerned about because they don't have all the quality and all of the components that they need for effective walking. So we want to look at the quality, especially at the ends of those ranges of normal. And because the range of normal is so large in young children, it's hard to talk about what does a 1-year-old do. Because some 1-year-olds are walking and some aren't, and they're fine. So we have to be careful about generalizing development for very young children. The other thing that I wanted to mention here is the importance of motor milestones. So motor milestones are those big motor achievements that little ones get. For example, sitting independently, crawling, walking, running, jumping, all those are typical motor milestones for little ones. And on all of the developmental checklists, you'll see that those are on there prominently, and we're supposed to mark when a child achieves those. So the reason these are so important is there's been quite a bit of research done on motor milestones, and the research shows us that children that achieve their motor milestones, their gross motor milestones, within the typical range when they're young, go on later on to have typical gross motor development. The children, however, who do not attain their motor milestones in the age range that is expected go on and have difficulty with their gross motor skills. So we do want to very carefully pay attention to when children achieve those motor milestones. Now let's look at some other generalities. When babies are first born, they have what's called physiologic flexion. This means that their little bodies are all curled up. So if you put a newborn baby down, they're curled up in the little ball in what people generally consider the fetal position. And that is indeed a leftover from their in utero positioning. Their arms and legs tend to be tightly curled into their bodies. Sometimes their ankles are crossed. And their hands are usually held just under their chin or maybe at their chin or mouth. So they're all curled up in a little ball. And if you pull an arm or a leg gently away from a newborn baby, it will spring back into flexion almost like a little rubber band. You're not hurting the baby to do that. And that is not that they're fighting against you, and that is not that they don't want to open up their body. They're just not ready yet. If we don't see physiologic flexion at birth, then we need to be concerned. That's what we call a floppy baby. So when babies are born, they're supposed to have that nice, tight tone into that curled up position. Babies who don't, babies who when you lay them down on a blanket kind of flop open their arms and legs, that's a very big concern. And that is usually noted at birth in the notes when a baby is born. Gradually, as a baby gets older, in the first few months of life, they start to release that physiologic flexion and they start to extend and explore and start to fight gravity. And in fact, all young children, their main job in life is to fight gravity. So motorically, children are constantly trying to overcome the pull of gravity. Now let's talk for a minute about the balance between flexion and extension and stability and mobility. These concepts are critical for normal motor development and normal motor function in the young children, and in fact in adults. But let's learn about them in typical development, and then you can apply that to the adult population when you get into those courses and think about those things. So the balance between flexion and extension, so I want you to do a little activity with me, if you would, is take your hand, make a fist out of it, and touch it to your shoulder so that your elbow is flexed and held beside your body. Now what you're going to do is release the tone in your biceps and just completely let your biceps go with no innervation whatsoever, and tighten your triceps really quickly, and your arm will fling out with very little control, right? Now try it again where you are continuing to contract your biceps and maintain some tension in them while you slowly increase the tension in your triceps, and you will notice a controlled extension of your elbow. And that is the balance of flexion and extension. And in fact, that is what is required to move functionally throughout your environment. You can't have just one side, the flexors or the extensors, be moving, because then you would move with uneven, very ill-coordinated movements. The other balance that's critical for function is stability and mobility. So think, for example, of a conductor conducting an orchestra. A conductor has to stand up tall, has to have stable lower extremities and a stable trunk and stable head and neck in order to move their arms and the mobility that they need in their arms to make all those large gestures in order to conduct the orchestra. If a conductor did not have good stability in their trunk and in their lower extremities, when they started to move their arms in all different directions, they would knock themselves over or fall down. In order to write at a table, which you may be doing now if you're taking notes, or maybe not if you're just listening, but in order to do that, you need to sit stably in the chair. You need to have your trunk stable, and you need to hold that core stability so that you can make those very tiny little movements in your fingers that are required for writing. So we always need a balance between stability and mobility and between flexion and extension in order to move effectively through our environment. So here are a few more developmental concepts that we need to grasp in order to move forward in our fine and gross motor development. One is that development moves cephalocaudally. And if you remember your medical terminology from first semester, cephalo means head, caudal means tail. So normal development proceeds from head to tail. And so when you think about a baby, a newborn, the first control that they gain motorically is head control. The first thing, so when you have a very newborn baby under 2-3 months of age, you hold them up on your shoulder, you always have to support their head because they don't have good head control. And in fact, they have very little control over their body at all. And they start to gain head control and be able to push back from your shoulder and look around and explore their environment. Then they start to get control over their shoulder girdle and their arms. They start getting hands to mouth and getting a little more control up there. Then they start getting more trunk tone, and they can sit when placed. And then they're going to get control right on through their trunk and down into their lower extremities to be able to crawl and eventually get up and walk. So the development goes from head to tail. The other way development happens typically is from midline to the extremities. So it starts in the center, and babies have their hands right up close to their face and up under their chin, and that's where they're going to do things. They're going to chew on toys, they're going to chew on their fingers, right up close to midline. And then as they start to develop, they start to move outward and start to reach for things that are outside of their center, either upward and downward or side to side. So the next part of development proceeds from midline out to the extremities. Development also proceeds gross to fine. So when you think about grasping, you think about a very young infant when they're reaching for something, it's a very large swipey kind of movement. They sort of aim in general at the thing. And actually the first few times that a baby is going to reach for, say, a mobile hanging over their head or keys that someone is dangling in front of them, they're going to kind of swipe and hit by mistake, right? They're just going to do a big swipey movement, and they'll hit them by mistake, and you'll often see a baby stop and startle a little bit and go, whoa, that was interesting. And so that encourages them to try again. And as they practice and they try again, they're going to actually try to aim for that shiny thing, whatever that was. So they're going to get more and more and more refined. So the gross to fine and general to precise kind of go together. So they're going to have big movements to very fine, delicate movements, and general swipey movements to more precise, targeted movements. The gross to fine also can be in terms of hand function. Babies are going to start with a gross grasp, where they're just going to take their entire hand and grab around whatever it is. And then as they develop and mature, they're going to start to use more delicate grasps until they finally get to index finger to thumb, pointer finger to thumb, very fine grasp. And then baby's development also proceeds from random to specific. If you lay a baby down on the floor on a blanket and you try to make them giggle, which is a good game with babies, try to make them giggle. When a baby smiles or giggles, their whole body smiles, right? Their whole self gets all involved in the smile. You see their arms and their legs get excited, and their eyes get excited, and their mouth gets excited, and their whole self is into it. It's kind of random, and it's their whole body. And then as babies get older, they learn to get excited just with their hands and their face, and their legs don't get as much involved. And then finally they can smile just with their face, and they can giggle just with their mouth, and they don't have that whole body response. Okay, let's take a look now at vision and hearing for newborns. Their visual acuity, in other words, what they can see sharply, what they can see well with good acuity, is at about 8 inches at birth. And if you imagine cradling a baby in your arm with their head resting in your elbow, the crook of your elbow, from their face to your face is about 8 inches. And what babies do when they're being held in that position is something called en-face staring. It's written there as E-N-F-A-C-E, but it's pronounced en-face staring. It means eye-to-eye staring. And if any of you have ever held a newborn baby, you know that they stare at you and you stare at them. That is normal and typical, and that is what we want to see. That lets us know that that baby is at least initially doing what they're supposed to do at birth. So babies can see in that cradled position an adult face, and indeed that's what they choose to look at the most. And if you put a baby down in their cradle or on the floor and you start to walk, the baby will track you. They will start to watch you walking around. And that is, again, very typical and normal, and we want to see that. By the time a baby is 12 months, their vision is up to 20/50. And as you know, adult typical vision is around 20/20. So babies initially, they'll track parents. They also have an initial preference for black and white or red and white or red and black, very distinct patterns. They like to see patterns, and they've done a lot of research with newborns in giving them different things to look at and seeing which ones they looked at longer. And they look at faces and they look at patterns longer. By 3 months, they're starting to be able to recognize faces of familiar people. And very, very early on, within hours of birth, babies can imitate faces. They're really great face makers. So one of the first faces they can imitate is tongue sticking out at only a couple hours old. You stick your tongue out at a newborn baby and they will do it back. At first they work at it and they're trying, but pretty quickly they can get tongue sticking out, and they can do a pout, and they learn very early how to make faces. And it's actually an early way that babies will communicate. And if you think about it, communication is reciprocal. In other words, right now what I'm doing, talking to you guys, is not reciprocal, because normally what I expect is I say something, I look at you, I wait, you say something back. That's normal communication. It goes back and forth in a reciprocal fashion. What I'm doing now, just talking, is a little awkward because there's nothing coming back at me. But babies practice that face making as a very beginning of that reciprocal interaction with other people, and it gets them set up to start to communicate later on. Hearing in babies is fine from the beginning. Their hearing is fully intact right at birth. Their discrimination improves over time, which means they can tell, was that a bell, was that a fire engine, was that the doorbell, or was that the kitchen timer, was that daddy's voice, was that mommy's voice, right? So that discrimination, both in terms of what the sound is and where the sound is, improves over time, but they hear just fine right from the beginning. Let's take a look at some reflexes. So in your textbook, it talks a lot about what happens when the reflexes don't integrate. But I would rather flip that around and talk about the purpose of reflexes. So reflexes are primitive reflexes is what I'm talking about. And these are come into play around 3 months of age or so. And each one has a purpose. They can indeed be a problem if they don't integrate as time goes on, but they each have a purpose. So let's step back for a second and talk about what I mean when I say integration of reflexes. So these reflexes, for example, you may know your startle reflex, right? So if somebody makes a very loud, unexpected noise, you jump a little bit, right? That's a startle reflex. You can't control that, right? You can't not startle. It's just what you do. If somebody throws something toward your face, you're going to blink, right, to protect your eyes. That's a reflex. You're not doing that on purpose. You're not timing that. Your body just knows that it needs to protect itself. So reflexes are very automatic. They're not under our control. They're not under a baby's control. And when they integrate, it means they're no longer, they're part of our repertoire. They become integrated into what we're doing. They don't get in the way, and they function when they need to, but they become part of our normal repertoire. So these are the ones I want you to know, these reflexes here that are listed on the slide. The first one is called the ATNR. It's the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. The asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. It's also known as the archer's pose. So if you take your right arm and you bend it up so that you're sort of like you're putting your hand on the back of your neck, so your elbow's sticking out, right? So your hand is up there. And then the other hand is sticking out straight to the side. And then you look at the hand that is extended. So you look like you're pulling the bow, an archery bow, so that the extended hand is like holding the bow, and then the hand that's back here by your ear is the one pulling the string. Excuse me. That's the ATNR. It's a tonic neck reflex because it is triggered by the position of the neck. Tonic meaning not mobile, but tone, right? So stable tone. A neck reflex. It's instigated by the position of your neck. So when a baby looks to the left, for example, the chin side or the left hand is going to extend, and the skull side or the right hand is going to flex up. Okay? And the purpose of that reflex is to allow the baby to touch what they're looking at. So the baby turns their head and sees a shiny Bryant & Stratton water bottle, which is sitting on my desk here. And they look at it and their hand reaches out and touches it. That is what we want. We want babies to learn to explore their world. And so this reflex allows a baby to touch what they look at. So that's very helpful. If it is in the way, if the baby, well, first of all, reflexes don't integrate if there's significant neurological damage. So primitive reflexes all come into play around 3 months of age, and there's a chart on Blackboard with all of the reflexes that goes along with this lesson. So please open that up and take a look at that. You're going to want to print that off and keep it. It's a nice chart. They start to be seen around 3 months, and they're integrated at different times. But the ATNR, if it becomes obligatory, that means that you can't stop it. You can't not do the ATNR. Well, then that's a problem, right? Because then every time you look at something, your hand reaches out to touch it. And then if you want to bring that object back to your mouth to taste it and explore it, it doesn't work. Your head turns the other way, right? Because that arm would flex, and then that would cause the head to turn and the other arm to extend. So when they become obligatory, they can be triggered by any part of the reflex, not just the neck. And it gets in the way. And so then you can't bring things to midline, right? You can't bring things to the middle to explore them because your head wants to go to one side or the other and have the chin side extended and the skull side flexed. The STNR is the symmetric tonic neck reflex. And that one allows, so what that one is when the arms are extended, the neck is extended, or rather the other way around. The neck is extended and the arms are extended. And then the legs are flexed. And then the opposite happens. When the head is flexed, the arms flex up and the legs extend. So what do we need this for? Think about a baby lying prone on their belly, and they want to push up and look around and explore their environment. Well, they're going to look up with their head, and the STNR is then going to cause those arms to extend, which is going to allow them to push up. It's called prone pivot, and they're going to be able to look around their environment and on their belly with their arms extended. So that's a useful thing. If it gets stuck, that means a baby can't crawl because they can't move one arm separately from the other because both arms extend together. So it makes crawling really difficult when a child has a stuck ATNR or an obligatory STNR. Sorry. The next one that we want to learn about is rooting. The rooting reflex is for feeding. So when the side, the cheek, the side of the face is stimulated by anything, by a hand, by the nipple, by anything, the baby will turn their mouth and try to suckle on whatever that is. So obviously that's helpful for feeding, so that when the baby feels the nipple on their cheek, they're going to turn and orient towards it so that they can feed. So that's obviously a very useful thing. However, if that becomes obligatory, every time something brushes the baby's cheek, they're going to try to feed on that. So that's a problem with clothing, with putting clothing on and off. That's a problem wearing a scarf or a hat or anything, or hair coming onto the baby's face. So it can get in the way, but it's actually a very useful reflex when it's in its timely fashion. And then it will integrate and go away, and a baby doesn't need it again after that. Palmar grasp, you all have hopefully seen that if you touch a baby's palm, they make a fist around your finger and they grab it. That is not because they're trying to hold your hand. That is indeed a reflex. So if you stimulate the palm of the baby's hand, they will form a grasp. And again, why do we do that? That is probably a leftover from very early times when babies were carried around by their moms. And if you think about a baby, if you carry the baby around and the baby grabs onto your hair, right, they're not going to fall down. So it's a way for the baby to hang on to whoever is carrying them so that they don't fall down. And then there is the TLR, the tonic labyrinthine reflex. This reflex allows for supine extension and prone flexion. So it allows a baby when they're on their back to be extended so they can look around and explore their environment, and when they're on their belly to be flexed so that they can be sleeping and cozy and flexed up. It gets in the way of prone propping from the previous one. It gets in the way of being on their belly and being able to push up with their hands, because when they're on their belly, they're going to be flexed. But it is helpful so that when they're on their back, they open up and they can start to look around. And it fights against that physiologic flexion. So it allows babies to open up from that physiologic flexion so that they can start to look around and explore their world and touch things. So in your book, it talks, as I said, about what goes wrong with when these reflexes are obligatory, but I need you to know also what the purpose is of them, because they have purposes. They're not just there randomly. Postural reactions don't integrate. So for example, equilibrium. If you are standing up and someone pushes you off center, you are going to extend your arms out to protect yourself. If they push you harder, you're going to extend your arms to protect yourself and maybe take a step, right? And if someone pushes you even harder so that you fall down, you're going to start by extending out to protect yourself, to try to stop yourself from falling. Then you're going to take a step, and if it's not good enough and you start to fall, then you're going to put your hands down and protect yourself from falling. And mostly you're going to be protecting your head and face, because that's what we are sort of programmed to do. So those equilibrium and postural reactions, those don't integrate. We have those for our whole lives. And in fact, we have some of the primitive reflexes in little vestiges through our lives. So if you think about the ATNR, which is that pose that looks like you're an archer, that archer pose. If you are pulling a tug-of-war rope, think about the position that you're in when you're under a lot of physical strain when you're pulling tug-of-war. We always do that pose. So when you're pulling something really hard, think about it. Put yourself in that position, holding that rope. You're going to be looking at your extended arm, and your other arm is going to be back by your cheek or by your ear on the other one, and you're going to be pulling with your whole body. So we use the ATNR and some of the other reflexes under stress, under duress, sort of to help us. So let's look back at infants again, and let's look at their social emotional development a little bit. Babies are comforted by being held. You can't spoil an infant. I think this is a really important point to make. People talk about spoiling a baby. Under a year of age, you can't spoil a baby. Babies need to know that when they cry, their needs are met. Someone comes to pick them up to figure out what's going on, whether they need to be changed, or they need food, or they're cold, or they're warm, or they need a hug. Whatever it is, the baby is telling you something by crying. Sometimes an infant, when they're trying to get to sleep, will fuss and cry to settle down. And that's also telling you that I'm tired, I need to fuss a minute, I need to settle down. So we can't spoil a baby. We don't want to let babies cry and say, oh, it's fine, she's just fussy. We want to understand that babies need to be held and comforted. There have been a lot of research about the need for human infants, and actually in other places in the animal kingdom, infants to being touched by their own kind. And all of the research is loud and clear that human infants will perish if they are not touched and held. So we need to hold them and touch them. If you look across cultures, you will see ways of holding babies attached to their parents' bodies, right? There are, in India, they use a cloth wrap to hold the baby next to their body. Native Americans used a papoose. Modern Americans use little snuggly things where it's like a backpack and the baby's in it and it's on your body. Those things are because we know babies need to be held, they need to be comforted, and they need human touch in order to thrive and survive, actually. Babies also self-calm orally by sucking on their fingers or their thumb or a pacifier or whatever they can find. That's how they self-soothe. If we don't allow babies to self-soothe, they can be very, very fussy, and it can be a real problem for their social emotional development. Not all babies suck on a pacifier or their fingers or their thumb, but we need to give them all the chance to do that. So if a baby doesn't suck on their fingers or their thumb, we need to at least offer them a pacifier to see if that's something that they want. Barry Brazelton is a developmental pediatrician, and he's written some brilliant books on stages of normal development. So if anybody wants to get one of Brazelton's books, He does a beautiful job of talking about the range of typical at all the different ages and what to expect. So that's a lovely resource for you to have if you're interested in doing pediatrics. Brazelton describes different stages of a normal cycle for babies. Deep sleep, light sleep, drowsiness, alert awake, fussy, and crying. And the way he describes it is that babies cycle through these all the time, and they cycle quickly when they're little, and as they get older, the cycle lengthens. So their sleep lengthens, their light sleep gets longer, their drowsiness, but then the alert awake phase gets really nice and long. So the deep sleep, light sleep, and alert awake get longer and longer, and the fussy crying and drowsy get shorter and shorter. And the whole thing gets longer, so it takes up a day rather than an hour or 2 hours. So, but babies will cycle through these, and as they're younger, they're easier to see these stages. So let's look at some of the gross motor development at birth. They have random movement of both their arms and their legs and their hands and their feet. Their hands may open and close. Their tongue may have random movements, stick their tongue out. Their eyes may get wide and small. They might make little crunchy faces. So there's random movement in their face and in their whole body. They have that nice physiologic flexion that we talked about before, and they will turn their head in order to follow people. And that's pretty much all they do at birth. I like to call the first couple of months of life the begonia stage because they're kind of like a pretty little flower, and you water them and put them in the sun and make sure they're warm and cared for, but they don't do a whole lot. You feed them, you change them. They don't give you a whole lot back just yet. Then, except for the enfant staring, they will do that. Then by about 2 months, they're starting to slightly lift their head when they're prone on their belly. They're going to roll from their side to their back. Now, rolling has changed a lot over the years. Back in the early years, back in the 80s, and in fact into the 90s, early 90s, I would say, babies were put to sleep on their belly. Because babies, when you put them on their belly, we learned earlier about the tonic labyrinthine reflex, they'll be on their belly, or all curled up on their belly in a nice little ball, and they're very cozy that way, and they enjoy sleeping on their belly. However, the United States had hugely high rates of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. Nobody really knows what causes SIDS, what the issue is, but a perfectly normal, healthy baby will be put to sleep and then sometime in the night perish. And it's a horrible, horrible thing. And so people looked at other countries around the world, researchers, and noticed that the U.S. had a very high rate of SIDS, and other countries that slept their babies on their back did not. They had much lower rates of SIDS. So without really knowing what causes SIDS or what really happens, and they still kind of don't know, they saw that, well, let's just sleep kids on their backs, and that seems to prevent a lot of SIDS from happening, and indeed it did. And the rates of SIDS in this country went down and more matched the rates in other countries. So now we sleep babies on their backs. Well, a lot of the developmental checklists were created before the Back to Sleep, which is what they call the campaign, the Back to Sleep campaign, started. So some of those developmental checklists and those developmental assessments show rolling first from belly to back, which is easier to push off, right? So belly to back rolling was fairly early on, maybe about 4 months. However, babies don't spend as much time on their belly as they used to, which is why people do tummy time and all that, which we'll get into. But babies spend a lot more time on their backs now because that's how they're slept, on their backs. And babies don't sleep on their belly until they're able to roll back and forth by themselves because you don't interfere once a baby can roll. So now babies roll first from their side to their back. They used to roll first from their side to their belly and back to their side again. So the rolling has changed with the back to sleep movement. And rolling also occurs later than it used to occur because it's harder to roll from your back to your belly than from your belly to your back because gravity is against you when you're rolling from your back to your belly. Anyway, at 2 months, they can roll from their side to their back, and they can hold their head with a wobble in supported sitting. So they're still going to have a little bit of a wobble. Now, by 4 months, that wobble is gone. When they're on their belly and they're propping in prone, which means they're pushing up with extended arms and looking around, they can do that up to about 90 degrees, so their head is just about vertical when they're doing that. Pull to sit means they're on their back, and you give them your hands, and they grab onto your hands, and you pull. They pull themselves up, right? So we never want to actually just yank the baby up into sitting. We want to offer our fingers for stability, and then they flex their arms and pull their shoulders and get themselves up into sitting. So at about 4 months, they can do that. They're getting their arms and hands to midline and to mouth, so they're starting to chew on their fingers, chew on objects in their hands, and all of that good stuff. By 6 months, they're rolling both ways. They're rolling belly to back and back to belly. They can get their feet into their mouth. Babies love to explore their feet, and at 6 months, that's when you see a baby holding both feet and kind of rocking side to side on their back while they're hanging onto their feet, and then they'll take one foot and taste it, and then the other one. Now when you do pull to sit, their head comes right up with them. They pull themselves right up. Their head is forward, not lagging back at all. They can crawl on their belly, and let's take a minute to talk about the difference between crawling and creeping. So creeping is when they're up on their hands and knees and their belly is not touching the ground. Creeping is high, so they're on their hands and their knees and their belly is up, like sort of typical baby crawling, but we really call that creeping. Crawling is like, think commando crawling. So they got their elbows and their knees, and they're on their belly is on the surface. So by 6 months, they can do that commando crawling or belly crawling. They can scooch, which means if you put a 6-month-old down somewhere, they're going to end up somewhere else. They scooch around by pushing their feet, by wiggling, by reaching for things, and they end up all over the place. So we have to be careful not to put a baby like this on, for example, a couch or on a bed, because they'll scooch and fall right off. The safest place to put babies is either in their crib or on a blanket on the floor. It is the safest, and it is also the way that helps promote the most typical development, because it promotes fighting gravity, which, as I said earlier on, is really their job. So when they start belly crawling, and in fact when they start creeping as well, babies often start by going backwards, because it is easy to just push with their arms. So if you put them on their belly and they have their hands under their shoulders, they're just going to push their arms and end up going backwards. It takes a little while till they figure out how to go forwards. But not to worry, they all figure it out, or most of them. At 6 months, they sit when placed. In other words, you take a 6-month-old and you sit them up, and you can let go, and they will sit there. Now, if they get excited and start giggling, they might fall over, or if they're reaching too far outside of their center of gravity, they might tip to the side or back. They're not going to be tipping forward at 6 months. They're going to be just fine. A 5-month-old, you're still going to need to put a pillow around, and they might end up going forward and bonking their face on the floor. But by 6 months, they should sit nicely with a nice straight back, their legs in a ring sit, so around, so that their feet kind of touch and their knees are on the floor. It's called a ring sit. And they're going to be pretty stable by 6 months of old in sitting. And that is one of those developmental milestones that we care a lot about. Moving on to 7 to 8 months. 7 to 8 month old is totally good with sitting. I know a pediatrician that used to call it the concrete patio test. He wouldn't call a kiddo independently sitting unless a parent would say that they would sit the child on a concrete patio and walk away. So when you're willing to sit your child on the middle of a concrete patio and walk away, then you know they're sitting solidly independently. When you stand a 7 to 8 month old, they're going to bounce a little bit. They're going to let go of their legs and bounce and go up and down like that. They enjoy that. And again, you'd be holding them because a 7 or 8 month old is not independently doing that yet. That's when held in standing. They're going to begin the high creeping at 7 to 8 months. Again, they might start by going backwards. And as soon as kids learn how to do something, they want to challenge themselves. So as soon as they start creeping, they're going to start creeping holding an object. So they're holding a toy or a pacifier or whatever they're holding. So they're often dragging around whatever they have grabbed onto, because as soon as they start creeping, they want to hang on to something. As soon as they start walking, they want to hang on to something. It's what they do. It gives them a purpose to their moving around. Their equilibrium reactions are starting to come through. So in sitting, if they're sitting independently and you give a little shove, they are going to put a hand out to try to protect themselves. So they are starting to get some equilibrium reactions. By 9 to 10 months, our baby is going to be standing at furniture with hands held or not. So they can stand holding on to furniture. They can stand with just their hands held. They might have to stand with a little help at furniture, but they want to be getting upright, right? They're done fighting gravity into sitting. Now they want to fight gravity in standing. They've upped the ante a little bit. They may be starting to take some steps, maybe not. They could be cruising. Cruising is when they are holding onto furniture while walking around. Now there's beginning cruising and there's more advanced cruising. So beginning cruising is when their body is kind of leaning up against maybe the couch, for example, and they have their hands on the couch and they're kind of walking sideways, but their whole body is leaning up against the couch, right? More advanced cruising is when they're going to go from furniture to furniture. So they're going to not be leaning up so much. They're just going to kind of be putting their hands on the couch as they walk sideways along. And then when the table is a step away, they'll take a step, reach and hold the table with the other hand, and then move themselves over. So more advanced cruising, they'll go from furniture to furniture, or from an adult to a piece of furniture, or something like that. By the time they're 9 to 10 months old, they're going to be throwing things. They're going to be throwing balls, their toys, objects. You put them in a high chair, they're going to throw everything. They're testing gravity. They're learning about gravity. They're learning what happens when things are launched, and they think it's pretty fun and silly. So you put some food on a high chair of a 9 to 10 month old, and you can pretty much guarantee they're going to start dumping things over the side and looking to see what happened, right? They want to watch it fall because they're learning about gravity. It can be a frustrating game, but it's what they do. 11 to 12 months, they're creeping. That's the high creeping, up on hands and knees very, very well. They go pretty fast. They're going to be crawling up the stairs, and they might be able to back down the stairs. At this age, they may be walking independently, maybe not. They're going to be squatting and stooping with a hand held. So squatting is going down flat feet, and their butt is almost touching the ground, so they're all balled up. Stooping is more bending over from the waist. A lot of babies will, once they get older, they'll play and squat so that they can get up and go at a moment's notice. 11 to 12 month olds are going to sit from a standing position without falling. In other words, before this, when they went to get down at 9 to 10 months old and they were standing, they would kind of plop on their butt and sort of fall down onto their butt. Now they're sitting more controlled. They're sitting down with purpose and with control, again with that balance of flexion and extension. High guard position is when they're walking with their hands up near their ears, up near their head. So when babies first start walking, they're looking for extra balance. So they don't put their arms out to the side, they kind of put them up and to the side. So they're sort of at level with their ears or the top of their head and held out to the side a little bit to give themselves extra balance and extra stability when they're learning how to walk. And at this point, they're starting to get their more advanced protective reactions for when they fall. A little more in the gross motor. 13 to 15 months, they're going to stand from the floor or trying to. And when kids start to stand from the floor, they do hands and feet. So they're going to be get themselves from sitting into hands and knees. And then they're going to push up with their feet with their hands still on the floor. And then they're going to kind of shift their weight back over their feet and then stand straight up. So that's what they're trying to do there. They're probably going to be able to bend down and pick up an object. They're going to sit with nice control. They're going to be able to play roll catch. So they're going to be able to roll a ball back and forth with purpose. to play catch with somebody. They still have a wide base when they're walking, so their feet are still pretty far apart, and their arms are starting to lower, and the high guard is starting to diminish. And again, this depends on when they started walking. So a 15-month-old who started walking at 9 months is going to be walking with more control than a kiddo at 15 months who just started walking at 12 or 13 months. So you have to make some adjustments for when the child learned to walk. These numbers, remember, these are very young children, and the range of normal is huge. So I'm giving you 2 months leeway here, 13 to 15, 16 to 18, but really there's a larger range of normal. And you have to use your clinical reasoning around whether or not it's typical in terms of quality. Anyway, so in general, 16 to 18 months, they're going to start and stop walking with control. So prior to this, they would walk until they hit an object or a person and then stop, or walk until they fell down. Now at 16 to 18 months, they can walk and stop and pick something up and look at it and turn and walk somewhere else. So they have a lot more control. They can walk up and down stairs holding onto something. They can walk backwards. They can turn. They have a lot more control over their motor skills. Okay, let's keep going with our gross motor development. We got to get up to 3. So at 19 to 24 months, our kids stable walking, turning backwards, walk sideways, all that good stuff. They're going to be able to get in and out of a child-sized chair. They're going to be able to throw with decent aim, kick a ball, squat in play. That's a really popular thing for these guys to do, is they'll find a toy, they'll squat, and they'll play with it, and that way they can just jump up and run off when they're done. They're going to be walking up the stairs with 2 feet per step. That's called marking time, as opposed to foot over foot. So the mature way to walk upstairs is 1 foot on each step, called foot over foot. And marking time, or 2 feet per step, is a more immature way, which is when you bring 1 foot up and then the second foot goes on the same step, and then both feet on the next step, and the next and the next. By 24 months, they can do that, 2 feet per step. By 2.5, they can run smoothly, walk up and down the stairs independently. Catching, they can do a large ball, they can walk on their toes. Alternating feet on the stairs means now they can do 1 foot on each step. They can jump down, they can hop like a bunny. They're doing a lot more stuff. So in just 2.5 short years, they've gone a huge distance in terms of their gross motor development. And by 3, they can stand on 1 foot briefly. A 3-year-old can pedal a trike. They can hop repeatedly in one place on 2 feet. They can walk heel-toe. They can catch balls. They can do all sorts of things. 3-year-olds are pretty capable motorically, little people. They can't quite yet do things like skipping, but they're getting there. So now let's take some time and look at fine motor development. Again, we're on typical development. Typical fine motor development proceeds from ulnar to radial, or ulnar to medial. So it's going to start on the pinky side of the hand and move to the thumb side of the hand. So initial grasping is always going to be at that pinky side. They're going to swipe from the pinky side to start grasping. Then they're going to have whole grasp in the middle, and then they're going to move toward what I call the business end of the hand, which is the thumb side and index finger side of the hand. That's where most high-level fine motor function happens. We need to have good radial side function in order to write, to cut, to open buttons and zippers, to do just about everything. Fine motor skills are going to proceed from gross to fine. Babies have a grasping reflex at birth, and it becomes less of a reflex. They continue to be able to grasp, obviously, throughout life, but it turns from a reflex into a purposeful grasping. We are going to talk a lot about kinds of grasps and pinches, and we're going to talk about imitate, copy, make. And what that is the first thing a baby will do is imitate, for example, a line on paper. Then they will copy it, which means you show them a line and then they can make the line. Imitate means you show them how to do it and they do what you did. Copy means you show them the finished product and then they can make it. Make means you say make a line and they can just make it all by themselves without any model or anything. So at birth, hands are fisted near the face. We have that physiologic flexion we talked about. And they have a reflexive grasp from the ulnar side that originates from the ulnar side of the hand. That palmar reflex is stimulation to the palm, and it starts with the pinky coming in and then the other fingers. By 2 to 3 months, they're starting a voluntary grasp, but they still have an involuntary release. So as we talk about grasp and release going forward, which we're going to talk a lot about in a lot of detail, we have to realize the difference between grasp and release, and they are different. Sometimes kiddos can grasp, but they can't release. Sometimes they can release, but they have a hard time grasping. So we need to look at those things separately and carefully. So it starts out with them starting to grasp, but then they let go of things by mistake all the time, and they don't mean it. And you can tell because they'll be holding something and all of a sudden they're not, and they look around like, what happened, right? And they're looking around to find what it was because they didn't mean to drop it. They can bring hands together at midline, and they can bat at hanging objects at 2 to 3 months. First, it seems like a mistake, and then when they get the thing to move, they get very excited, and then they work harder and harder, and then they learn how to actually hit things on purpose. At 4 to 5 months, their hands are mostly held open. Now, when we talk about held open and held closed, hands fisted near the face, they're back at birth, the thumb is always out. So when a baby is holding their hand in a fist, the thumb is out and around the index finger or the middle finger. The thumb is not caught inside the palm. When the thumb is caught inside the palm, that's called a cortical thumb. And that is a neurologically immature thing. We don't see that in typical development. That is only in atypical development in children with neurological impairments. So you never want to see the fist with the thumb inside the palm. That's always going to tell you that there's some sort of neurological damage in there somewhere. So the fist is always going to be with the thumb out of the palm. And by 5 months, the hand is not fisted tightly. It's sort of loosely open or fully open. By here, they're going to be able to transfer objects from hand to hand, and this is one of the early fine motor milestones that we look for, being able to transfer objects from hand to hand. If we don't get this, we have to suspect that maybe one of the hands is not working as well as the other. We do not want to see handedness, like right or left-handedness at this age. It is too young. They need to still be exploring with both hands. We don't usually see handedness until closer to 1.5 to 2 years. So at 4 to 5 months, we want even-handedness. We want them to transfer objects back and forth comfortably. And that's how we know that both sides of the body are comfortably integrated and both developing correctly. They are going to bring objects effectively to their mouth to explore by this age. This 4, 5, 6 months age, they are always kind of wet. Kids in their face and hands, they're always sticking everything in their mouth. So you want to make sure that they have an environment where they can do that and objects that they can explore with their mouth. So they are feeling with their mouth and their tongue, they are smelling with their nose, and they are touching with their hands. So they're using and they are looking with their eyes. They're using lots and lots of senses to get to know their environment. And what you often see is you often see a baby this age holding an object with 2 hands, looking at it, tasting it, looking at it, tasting it again. So they're smelling and tasting and feeling it with their mouth, and they're taking it away, they're looking at it, they're turning it over, feeling it with their hands, and then tasting it again. So they're really, really exploring what it is that they are hanging on to. By 6 months, a child can reach with one hand effectively to grab something. When you give them a pellet, something tiny like a Cheerio, something small, they're going to use a raking grasp. We are going to talk more about grasps going forward and practice different grasps. But for now, that's a raking grasp is a whole open hand that then closes up over the object. They're going to be able to take a second object while holding a first. This is a big thing. So that if they're hanging on to one toy and you offer them another one, initially what a baby is going to do before 6 months is drop what they're holding and reach for the second object. By 6 months, they're not going to be doing that anymore. Now, when you hand them the second object, they're going to still hold that first one and reach out with the other hand for the second object. We're actually going to look at several levels of that getting objects thing. So the first one is hand the baby an object, they take it. Then hand them a second object, they drop the first object to get the second. Then the next stage, they hang on to it to get the second. And the next stage is you give them another one, and they're going to gather that one and get the next one even. So they start to understand how to kind of like get more and more objects while they're still hanging on to the other ones. So by 7 to 8 months, a radial palmar grasp is developing. A palmar grasp means they're grasping it with their whole hand. Radial means they're approaching from the thumb side. Okay, so they're not approaching from the ulnar side anymore. Now they're approaching from the radial or thumb side. But it is still a palmar grasp. It is still the whole hand flat down, so the palm is grabbing, not the fingertips. You're going to show them how to hit a cup on a spoon onto a cup, and they're going to be able to bang these two objects together. They're going to be able to remove objects, so taking a cube out of a cup or removing an object from another object container. They're going to be able to take a peg out of a hole. They can't put them in yet, but they can take them out. And another one of the large fine motor milestones we look at is banging two objects together. And that again is showing us that their two-handed bilateral skills are working together. Both hands are functioning, that they're symmetrical, and that they have the strength and the coordination to hit those together. And in fact, they enjoy it. It's a lot of fun. They like to hear what different things sound like when you bang them together. So you see a lot of banging blocks or whatever two objects are at hand together to see what they sound like and what they look like and what happens. They'll try it with their food. They'll try it with everything. 9 to 10 months old, they're going to be doing an inferior pincer on a pellet. An inferior pincer is the thumb and index finger, but it's pad to pad, not tip to tip. When we get in class together, we will practice all these grasps. You can see what they look like. But it's the pad of the index finger to the pad of the thumb. They are going to release a cube or an object, but it's not going to be well controlled. It's going to be purposeful, but not well controlled at this point. And by 9 to 10 months, they're going to be able to isolate their index finger, which means hold your hand in a fist and just extend out your index finger with the other fingers curled up and your thumb around your middle finger. So that pointing, so that sort of mature point, is also a very important fine motor developmental milestone for us that shows that they are really getting over onto that radial side of the hand, and they're starting to use those the thumb and the index finger on that side of the hand primarily. Prior to that, when they pointed, they would have all their fingers extended, and the index finger would just be like a little higher up extended. But now they can actually close those other fingers and extend that index finger, and that's getting to the beginning of finger isolation, which is required for higher level fine motor skills. 3-jaw chuck grasp is developing. That is how you would pick up like a block, like a 1-inch cube. You would use your thumb as opposed to your middle finger and index finger. So your middle finger and index finger and thumb form like a triangle, and then you would pick it up. That's a 3-jaw chuck. The word comes from, I don't know how many of you know, but if you ever put a drill bit into a drill, and you look at in a drill, when you put the bit in, the bit is a circle, right? And the chuck that you put it into has 3 pieces in it, and you stick the drill in the middle between the 3 pieces, and then you screw the side of it, and it clamps down on that drill bit. And that 3-part thing that you stick the drill bit into is actually called a chuck. And so a 3-jaw chuck is when you use your 3 fingers like the inside of that drill to hold the bit, but you use it to hold objects. And again, the child is going to be able to take things out of a container. So we have more controlled release, and we have more controlled taking out. So by 12 months, a baby is going to be able to scribble after a demonstration. That's imitating scribbling, okay? And it's just random scribbles. They're going to have a fine pinch of a pellet at 12 months. That means the tip of their index finger and the tip of their thumb. So imagine that you're picking up a hair or a pin from a tabletop. The grasp you'd use to pick up a pin is the tip of your finger and the tip of your thumb together. That's a fine pinch. And that's at 12 months. So it's pretty young that we expect that. A lot of people think fine pinch is, at 3 or 4 years of age, but no, it's actually at 12 months. It's a young skill. They also should be able to hold a crayon. Now they're probably going to hold a crayon in a fist, and probably a fist either with their radial side down and their hand over pronated, or they'll be in neutral supination and the crayon, the bottom of the business end of the crayon will be outside the ulnar side, and they'll be scribbling with their hand up. One way or the other, it's some kids do it one way, some kids do it the other. It doesn't really matter so much. They're going to try to stack two things. They're going to try to stack blocks. They're going to try to stack books. They're going to try to stack toys, stuffed animals, whatever they can. They're going to try to see what happens when they put things on top. They're exploring, they're learning their worlds. They're going to be able to, at 12 months, also be able to turn the pages of a book when you're reading a story. 13 to 14-month-old babies are going to try to release a pellet into a bottle. So now this is not just a clumsy release, this is a very, very targeted release. They're going to pick up a small object and put it into a small bottle. So they're getting a lot more control. They're going to imitate a specific scribble back and forth, not just random scribbling, but more of like a coloring in kind of a scribble. They're going to be able to stack 3 objects. Now, not only are they going to be able to take the peg out, they're also going to be able to put the pegs in to a pegboard. They're going to try to open containers, taking lids off, putting lids on, putting objects in. This is where kids love dump and fill. So they're going to fill up a container with things and then dump it out and think it's fabulous, and then fill it up again and dump it out again. So this is the time when you let the kid at the Tupperware and with their toys, and they just spend tons and tons of time putting objects inside each other and taking them out, and they go wild with all the Tupperware and have a good old time. They love opening and closing things. It's a little annoying because they like opening and closing cupboards and doors and things where their fingers can get pinched. So it can be a little bit disturbing sometimes and a little dangerous for their little fingers, but they really love the idea of opening and closing. And a lot of toys at this age have little doors with objects inside that they can open the door and see little objects, and they think those are fantastic. So the busy boxes with the little doors where you turn or poke or twist and things pop out of doors, they think those are just fabulous at this age, because then they get to slam them all shut and open them all up again, and they think that that's just fantastic. They also really do like real objects, even though they like busy boxes and toys. They're going to be a lot happier sitting on the floor, opening a cupboard with Tupperware in it, filling and dumping and filling objects out of there, and then closing the cupboard door and opening the cupboard door. They're going to have a blast. You could get a whole dinner prepared with a kid sitting on the floor doing that at this age. They're also going to be able to put rings on a ring stacker. Not necessarily in the right order, but they'll be able to get them on. Moving on to 15 to 18 months old with our fine motor development. By now, a child can stack a tower of 4 objects, generally blocks, but whatever objects they're stacking. They can scribble by themselves, so spontaneously you give them a crayon and a piece of paper and they will just go ahead and scribble. You want to be careful that you don't give them markers and white walls because they'll scribble all over those. So you're going to have to start putting into place some expectations of where to do things because they can start getting into some trouble at this age. They're going to be able to put small objects into a container, take them out, do all sorts of in and out of all different size objects. And now they're going to be starting to imitate a vertical stroke. And then moving on to 18 to 24 months, they're going to do something called in-hand manipulation. In-hand manipulation is something we're going to talk about a lot. It's a very important skill. It's being able to manipulate things within your hand. And there are several kinds of in-hand manipulation, and we're going to go through the specifics of that going forward. But just to know that the beginning kind of in-hand manipulation is things like turning a key of a wind-up toy, right? So you know how you have to turn the key of a wind-up toy and your thumb and your finger sort of slide by each other when you do that. And that's called simple rotation. And it's the first in-hand manipulation that kids will do. Simple rotation is also required for opening a jar lid, right? So that's the same sort of thing. So they're starting to do those things right around here. Again, the dump and fill game is very popular here. It's getting more advanced here with smaller objects and smaller containers, variable sizes of objects inside variable size containers. Nesting of things, so they're learning all that size discrimination by putting things in other things and taking them out. They're getting a much better handle on how gravity works and how sizes work. They're going to be scribbling with an ulnar palmar grasp. Generally, it could be a radial palmar grasp, but usually they start with ulnar. So that means the crayon is coming out of the pinky side of their hand, and their hand is slightly supinated, and they're coloring like that. They're going to be doing a circular stroke. So the difference between a circle and a circular stroke is big. So a circular stroke is when you go round and round and round and round. A circle is one and then you stop where you started. So it's a one discrete single circle. They're not able to do that yet at this age. They're able to go round and round and round, but they can't just do a discrete circle yet. But they're probably doing a horizontal and a vertical line in imitation, not yet copying. They can also imitate a train of blocks, so 3 blocks in a row. By 2 or 2.5, they're up to 10 block towers. Opening jar lids effectively. They were starting that in-hand manipulation last time, some simple rotation by 18 months. Now they're really good at taking the lids off the jars. They're beginning to think about scissors, and we'll get into how scissor skills work later on. There's a whole developmental sequence in there. Now they're going to be able to make a single circle. They're not doing just the strokes anymore, round and round and round. Now they can make one discrete circle and end it where they started. They're beginning to string large beads and putting square pegs into the holes so that they line up. Round pegs are easy. You can put them in any which way. Square pegs, you have to line up the corners and the sides, and at this age, they're able to do that. By 3, they are not just imitating a single circle, but if you show them a single circle, they can copy it. They can cut, they can make fringe and, cut. Again, we'll talk about the sequence of cutting later on. They are going to be imitating a block bridge, which is 2 blocks on the bottom and 1 on the top in the middle, so that there's a little bridge underneath there. They're going to be stringing 1/2-inch beads and drawing a person's face, a simple person. They're just probably going to do a face at first, maybe arms and legs over the next year or so. By 5, some kids still don't have bodies. They just have tadpole people, which is a face with arms and legs. So at 3, they're just going to be doing a face. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the progression of drawing. It has its own progression within it. The first thing they're going to do is make marks on paper, then scribble in imitation, and then scribble by themselves. Then they're going to be able to imitate and then copy vertical, horizontal, circular stroke, circle, and then across and angles and a face. So first they're going to be able to imitate, then they're going to be able to copy, then they're going to be able to make them on their own. So this is the developmental sequence within the sequence. So when we're looking at where a kid is at, we want to know where they are now, compare that to typical and see if that's okay. And if it's not, we want to know what's next so we can help them move forward to the next skill. So let's look a little bit at dressing and self-help in terms of our development. I put it in here with gross and fine motor development because it's very much tied to how their gross and fine motor development is coming along, in addition, obviously, to their visual perceptual skills, which we'll talk more about later. They have to have the balance and equilibrium reactions to, for example, stand on one foot while you put your pants on, to reach and push your arm into the armhole of something without falling over. So they have to have that core stability to have the mobility. They have to have the balance and equilibrium reactions. They have to understand their body and where it is in space. And they have to have good touch sense, tactile awareness, to feel the clothes sliding on their body in the right places. They also can't be too tactily defensive, in other words, annoyed or upset by touch. They can't be too upset by it because then they're not going to do dressing. And in fact, we see our children with tactile defensiveness are the ones that have very delayed dressing skills because they don't want that cloth rubbing up and down on their body. It feels terrible to them and actually painful. So typically undressing comes first before dressing. So kids can get naked by about 2, but they can't get things on till about age 3. They're going to be able to do their tops before their bottoms. Socks are a good marker both for children and for older people, because socks are the last thing kids learn how to put on. They're the hardest to put on, and they're the first thing that people lose if they're losing skill, like an older person or a person with a condition or disability, because it's hard to get down there. If you have balance issues, coordination issues, vision issues, any of the issues that happen with older or people with disabilities, socks are the first thing to go that they can no longer do. So socks are a really important indicator. They're also one of the earliest things that kids take off. Socks come off at about 6 months. Hats and socks are the earliest dressing skill for babies. At 6 months, if you have a baby that has socks and you put them in a little baby seat and you turn around 2 minutes later, those socks are gone. It's hard to keep socks on little babies. So they're the last thing they learn how to put on independently. They're the first thing they learn how to take off independently, and they are the first thing that people lose the ability to put on by themselves. So socks are important. Fasteners are the last to master, first opening them and then closing them. And the last skill to come is shoe tying. That's the hardest dressing skill to acquire, and that happens around 5. So here's a general look at the dressing skills. Again, this is general. Kids, do things at different rates, of course, but this is the broad strokes. So at 6 months, they can remove hats and socks, as I said. 12 to 18 months, they're going to help with undressing and present a body part for dressing. So they're going to, if you get their shirt partway off, they'll pop it off their head. If you get their pants off down to their feet, they'll pull their feet out. So they help undress, and when they're dressing, they'll push their arm into their sleeve. They'll push their head up into the collar of a shirt, things like that. By 2, they should be able to get naked for their bathtub, to get changed. By 3, they should be able to get things on, although they might not always be facing the right way or front, up, down, forward, backward, or any of that. By 4, they can orient front, back, inside, outside. I think can actually get things on the right way around. And by 5, they're going to have all their fasteners in addition to that. Buttons, zippers, shoe tying, all that stuff.